And we're back in our 1-hour Newsmaker show. Now we switch over to our regular guest, Dr. Gary Ostrower. Dr. Ostrower, thanks for calling in.
Well, thanks for having me here. I'm calling from home today because, like most people, we're confined to our residences.
Dr. Ostrower, you used to be the mayor of Alfred. Can you imagine being a mayor at this point with this COVID-19 crisis?
I'm glad I'm not the mayor right now. Yeah, it's going to be tough. And the village of Alfred, I might add, has declared a state of emergency, as have many, many other communities here in New York State. On the local level, the mayors really don't have very much authority at all. It gives them a kind of platform. But on the state level, of course, it does. And there are about 31 states, I think it's 31 states, that have passed legislation over the past few years, really past 30 years or so, which essentially give the governors the authority to override existing statutes and to override existing administrative regulations. And so they can do things like closing down a state university system. And so forth, and it's real authority. Now there are a number of other states, I think around 8 of them, which have no such authority at all. So the governors are just handicapped in respect to what they can do. And then the remainder of those, which I think is around 15 or whatever it is, have limited additional authority in respect to a state of emergency. But these are unusual times, and I think that as you asked the question about being mayor, our budgets are going to be hit. Sean Hogan in the previous half hour was talking about that. Every community, small communities, and, of course, large cities like Buffalo and New York City are going to take a real hit. And ultimately, this is going to fall on the taxpayer. Maybe the cities are going to borrow additional monies if they have the ability to do that, in which case the taxpayers will eventually have to pony that up in respect to loan repayments and so forth.
Dr. Ostrower, that was very helpful having Sean Hogan on. There's a little tension there between the governor of New York State, Governor Andrew Cuomo, and the mayor of New York City, Mayor Bill de Blasio. And there's nothing new about there being tension between the governor and the mayor of New York City. But it was interesting in yesterday's press conference that we carried with Governor Andrew Cuomo and the day before, the governor had been stressing that he's tired of seeing all these kids out playing basketball on the streets, and he's tired of seeing these big gatherings in the parks in New York City. And the governor said, I think he said it's Sunday about Monday, I'm giving the mayor of New York City 24 hours to come up with a plan to end all this. And then at yesterday's press conference, the Monday press conference, Governor Cuomo said, hey, we've had 24 hours, and I haven't heard from Mayor Bill de Blasio yet. Now, from what I understand from Dr. Heineman, and you would also know the answer to this question, Dr. Ostrower, having been in New York State politics yourself as the village mayor at Alfred, what the governor says goes in this situation. He has more authority than the mayor of New York City.
Well, he does have more authority, but he doesn't have unlimited authority. And I think that there's another issue that de Blasio is dealing with, which is a very, very practical, day-to-day kind of thing. How do you get these kids to stop playing basketball? How do you get these kids to stop, wandering around in large groups? It's not so easy to do that. You don't want to turn your community, you don't want to turn your city into a police state. The police also have limited powers at this point. There aren't, New York City has, I think, 22,000 cops, but they're not all on the street at the same time. So the issue of enforcement, I think, is every bit as important as the regulations that are issued from the governor's office. And I don't know that either Cuomo or that de Blasio is able to deal with that subject of enforcement as an effective way as they would like to. On the other hand, I do want to say something, if I may, about Governor Cuomo. He has really stepped up here in a way that I have never seen him in the past. I am not a Cuomo fan. I've been very skeptical of a number of things that he's done, in particular in respect to anti-corruption activity and so forth. Having said that, he's provided real leadership. And not only has he provided real leadership in New York State, he has provided probably more leadership on the governor's level than any other governor in the United States right now. You got to hand it to him. Sometimes in a crisis, people who you don't expect to step up do so. Mayor Giuliani did that after 9/11, and I think that Andrew Cuomo is doing that right now. And I say that because you have a failure of executive leadership in Washington. President Trump said at one point, and just very, very recently, when he was asked a question about, do you take responsibility, or do you feel that you have any responsibility, is the way it was said. Do you have any responsibility for the lag in our preparation for this crisis? And of course, the questioner, the reporter, was referring to the fact that that Trump had minimized the seriousness of this coronavirus issue for about 2 months or so. And the president responded, I don't take any responsibility at all. And yet compare that, for instance, to Harry Truman, who had a sign on his desk that said, the buck stops here. So that failure of leadership in Washington has created a vacuum, and I think we're finding a number of governors, but most importantly Andrew Cuomo, filling that vacuum. And there's one other person who is filling that vacuum, and that's Anthony Fauci. That is, Anthony Fauci is the head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. He's been around for a long, long time. I think that Sean Hogan alluded to the fact, and I would reinforce this, that people like Fauci are non-political. They are experts. They are, in every sense, committed to the public good, to public health, to the public welfare. And he, too, I think, has attained a degree of visibility and a degree of respect which is, kind of unexpected, and I think very, very welcome. Although I do find it kind of interesting that in the last 3 press conferences that the president has had, Anthony Fauci has been missing. He had attended virtually all of the previous press briefings, and then the last 3 he missed. 2 of them, I think one was on Thursday and one was on Friday of last week. He was asked over the weekend during a CNN town hall, why did you miss that? And he said, don't read anything into it. I was simply busy doing other things.
Yeah, the president said something last night about that. They asked him, the reporters asked Trump last night why Anthony Fauci was not at last night's presser, and somebody answered for the president. The president repeated the answer that Fauci was at one of the meetings for the whatever the group that they call themselves these days, the Corona panel or whatever they're called.
Well, you mean the coronavirus task force?
Yeah, that.
But the head of the task force, a woman by the name of Deborah Bricks, was there with Cuomo. So not with Cuomo, with Trump. So I'm not sure that I buy that explanation. I think it's entirely possible, and this is purely speculation, so don't take this too seriously. But I think that the president does not want to be upstage. We have a president who has a very, very big and rather fragile ego, and he doesn't want to be upstaged by anyone. And up to this point, I think he knows that, for good or ill, Anthony Fauci has gotten an awful lot of praise by virtually every news organization, from the far right to the far left.
Dr. Ostrower, this situation with the COVID-19 virus, when the flu epidemic hit in 1918, did it ever happen that there were business shutdowns, or were they less scientifically prepared in 1918 and had less tests, less data to work with? And how did that work out in 1918?
Well, they did have business shutdowns in 1918, but it's kind of interesting because it wasn't really attacked on a national level so much as it was on a local level. So, for instance, in New York, they had a mayor. I can't remember his name, but they had a mayor who really took charge, who did shut down businesses, who did shut down schools, who did cancel parades and things like that. In Philadelphia, a similar city, not quite as large as New York, but an eastern city, similar kind of population, they did not. As a matter of fact, they held a huge parade. This is in September of 1918, shortly before the war ended, before World War I ended, that brought out, I think, over, or at least close to 1 million people. Well, the disease rate, the flu rate in Philadelphia just skyrocketed, whereas in New York State it more or less plateaued. So this issue of what we call social distancing, of confining people to their homes and so forth, clearly has some historical validity. And that's one of the reasons, based, in other words, on what did happen in 1918, that's one of the reasons why epidemiologists have been so insistent that we go in the direction that we have. And it's kind of, at this point, we still have a debate in this country. There are some states that have not imposed any kinds of restrictions in respect to crowd control and whatnot. There are many other states, including, of course, New York and California and Florida and now Michigan and Maryland, New Jersey, that have imposed these restrictions. And the President of the United States said as recently as yesterday that maybe we should relax these things. That is to say, keep them in place for perhaps 2 weeks, but we don't want to damage the economy, and therefore we should think about a kind of phased, ending of these restrictions. And yet the public health officials, and this includes Anthony Fauci, are very, very much opposed at this point to relaxing these restrictions. What they're arguing is that we can expect these numbers, the numbers of cases, the numbers of deaths, to increase at least sharply for the next 4 or 5 weeks, and therefore this is the wrong time. This is the wrong time to place economic welfare over public health. And I want to just offer one other statistic that may put a little bit of this into perspective. Some of our listeners may know this already. It took approximately 2 months, a little bit more than 2 months, for the first 100,000 COVID-19 cases to appear, in China. It then took about 12 days for the next 100,000 to appear. It then took just 4 days for the next 100,000 to appear. In other words, that curve goes up, and it goes up sharply if there are not social distancing restrictions. An individual with a normal case of a normal cold might infect one other person, maybe statistically 1.3 other people. But with this COVID-19 virus, an individual is likely to infect because it is so very, very contagious. An individual is likely to infect 3 to 4 other individuals. And that is why it is so incredibly important to keep people apart from other people. We have to flatten that curve, and if we don't flatten that curve, we may see, and this is really frightening, we may see the collapse of our hospital system, of our health system as we know it.
We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with Dr. Gary Ostrower here on our 1-hour Newsmaker show in just a moment.
Courts Auto Collision.
Hi, Bill.
Never seen an insurance job we both can't make money on yet.
Bill?
And yes, I still have a free loaner car.
Bill, I just called to...
Courts Auto Collision, State Route 36, south of Canisteel, 698-9900. Online at McCourtsCollision.com.
Bill, for the first time in my life, you have left me speechless.
I am Bill McCourt.
Wow.
Checking in now with meteorologist Rob Carroll, who says it's going to be a couple of rainy days.
Yes, but not today, Brian. We actually got a dry one in today, but a storm system's already starting to take shape down over the northern Gulf Coast, Tennessee River Valley, out into the Midwest. That's our next chance for precipitation late tonight and into tomorrow. And it looks like another one will head our way for late Thursday and on into Friday. So keep the umbrella handy. Good news is, right now it doesn't look like you really need to use the snow shovel very much. We've got clouds out there this morning. Starting to see some breaks in southeastern Ontario, also lower Hudson River Valley. I think later today will be our chance to see a little bit of sun. Should bump the temperatures up to about 45 to 50. Sunrise this morning, 7:04. Sunset tonight at 7:28. We'll have clouds tonight. After midnight, we'll start to run the risk of a couple of showers. Lows tonight, 30 to 35. Good news is the pavement temperatures have come up, so I don't expect icing to be an issue tonight. Scott scattered showers, milder for tomorrow. We're 45 to 50. It turns partly to mostly cloudy tomorrow night, 30 to 35. Clouds, maybe a little sun Thursday morning, and then the chance of late-day showers Thursday, 55 to 60. A few more showers are possible Thursday night and into Friday, Brian.
Thank you, Rob. Back to Gary. Dr. Gary Ostrower, a longtime Alfred University history professor, reading off some of the president's tweets from this morning. And this is from a couple of minutes ago. Congress must approve the deal without all the nonsense today. The longer it takes, the harder it will be to start up the economy, and our American workers will be hurt. Here's a tweet from about 40 minutes ago. This is not about the ridiculous Green New Deal. It's about putting green workers and companies back to work. And here's another tweet from 40 or so minutes ago. The Defense Production Act is in full force, but have not had to use it yet. Millions of masks coming as backup to the United States. Dr. Ostrower, your reaction to those tweets?
Well, first of all, I think it's time for Trump to stop talking about the Chinese virus, because most of those masks that he's talking about are manufactured in China. We are dependent on the Chinese as the Chinese are dependent upon ourselves. And one ought to kind of end a lot of this nationalistic stuff in favor of recognizing the importance of public health. Number two, the Defense Production Act of 1950 allows the president to step in and do things that, a president simply could not, even under emergency powers, do earlier. The president could, if he wants, require companies to manufacture those ventilators, to manufacture more respirators, certainly in this country to manufacture those masks and so forth. I am very, very surprised that the president has not stepped in here, but the President Trump is President Trump, and in many ways I think he's very sensitive to the interests of big business. I'm reading a book right now, and the book is called The Splendid and the Vile. It's a new book. It's a history of Great Britain, and particularly of Churchill, of Winston Churchill, in the period from the time that that France fell in 1940, when the Nazis, when Churchill first became prime minister, when the Germans attacked France. France fell about 6 weeks later, and it continues for approximately 1 year. And in many ways, it's the story of not just Winston Churchill, but it's the story of leadership. It's the story of the kind of leadership that, I only wish we enjoyed right now. That's what I was saying before, that, you have governors who are stepping into that vacuum. I recommend the book. It's just a wonderful story, a lot of really, really interesting detail. But, it shows in this case, a prime minister who mobilized the country, not only through words, in ways that allow them to defeat the Nazis. The Defense Production Act, in some ways, gives our president the opportunity to step into that area and to provide, as I say, those ventilators, and to provide those respirators in ways that right now we simply don't have them. I have a nephew who is a doctor he's an ear, nose, throat pediatric specialist in a hospital in Florida. He says that he had to cancel all non-essential surgery, and he and other doctors, regardless of their medical specialty, are going to be moved into the area of dealing with corona people. And he says, and you've heard this before, they do not have enough protective equipment. He's worried. He's worried about his own health. He's worried about the health of the people that he is working with, his own associates, both the physicians as well as the nurses and so forth. This is an emergency situation, and I think that, at the very, very least, the Defense Production Act should be mobilized in ways that will provide us with the equipment that all of these hospitals, including in Hornell, will need right now. And if I can make one last comment about the legislation. The legislation is legislation. You got to read it, and if you read the legislation that I hope will be passed this morning, it probably will. We notice three things. Number one, that the president has not negotiated this. He left it to his Secretary of the Treasury. Again, I think it says something about that failure of presidential leadership. Number two, you got to look at the details. The fine print is really important. For instance, the legislation that the Republicans had proposed, as recently as yesterday, would allow loans to businesses, loans to companies, to large companies, without having to disclose what those companies were. And those companies could include things like Trump's hotels. They can include things like Trump's golf courses and so forth. I think that, public information, sunlight, if you will, is very, very important to this. And thirdly, I think that we have to understand that the legislation is going to almost certainly will provide specific aid to hospitals. It will provide aid to many, many smaller businesses, and it's going to provide individual payments of up to $1,200 to people who make less than $75,000 a year, and somewhat less of a payment to people up to $99,000 a year. If you happen to have a salary or a joint income of more than $99,000 a year, you're not going to receive any payment from this. But the point again is that we have to pour money into the economy. It's really, really important, and I'm glad that the Republicans, who were so opposed to a bailout bill, to a stimulus bill in 2008, clearly have signed on to some kind of a stimulus bill here in 2020.
With that, we do have to get going to fulfill our morning network obligations. But Dr. Gary Ostrower, always good having you on. Thank you for calling in, Gary.
Well, I hope we enjoy the warmer weather, and I hope we enjoy a healthy future.
Thank you so much. It's AM 1480 WLEA Hornell.